Hello, class. Today is October the 13th. We had a lot of internet issues, or I had a lot of internet issues this morning. So I want to do another video for those who were online, as well as those who will be watching the video a little bit later. So this is the week of October 12th. We are in week 6. Let's go to your D2L page. See if I can share it. All right. Right here, we're in week 6, October the 12th, and let's check and see what you have for this week. Here's your PowerPoint. We'll go over that a little bit later. Your weekly, you have your Old Testament book outline, assignment, as well as two really cool videos that you got to check out. They give you a good explanation about the book of Exodus. So it's two really short videos. You could put them on, in the morning or something when you're not doing a whole lot. And it is really, really good. It's kind of animated, so it keeps moving. Let's talk about this weekly discussion post. This is question number 7, and it comes from page 121. In this discussion post, you're going to dig a little bit more in the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus is largely about a main character named Moses. And I want you to thumb through the book of Exodus and find out a little bit more about him. And you can do some more additional research and find out how Moses is portrayed in the book of Exodus. You may need to do some additional reading from your Bible and be specific. You can, if you quote another book, make sure you give that person credit. Okay. You have an assignment. It is the Old Testament book outline, and you're going to choose one book from the Old Testament, from Genesis to the book is Malachi, with the exception of the book of Psalms. With the exception of the book of Psalms, okay? And with that, you are going to tell me who is the author of the book, when was it written, okay? A lot of the books, you can find that information out in the beginning of the book. Sometimes in your Bible, it'll tell you some information about who it was written by. I want you to thumb through the book. Tell me how it was introduced. Sometimes it starts off, like in the book of Genesis, it started off as creation. The book of Exodus, it starts off with the birth of Moses. And then what happens in the beginning chapters. And number 3, you're going to tell us how does this book of the Bible progress? What happened in the middle of the, is there some type of big thing that happened? Was there some type of, big war or whatever? Did somebody move from place to place? You can summarize what happens. I'm not expecting you to say what happened in every chapter. We don't need all that, but just kind of summarize what's happening and what happens in the, in the middle and the end. Number 4, identify one main character of the book, just one. There's several characters in all of the books, but just choose one, okay? And there you can tell me, how does God work through this main character? What is this pertinent to this book of the Bible? And then you're going to tell me how the book flip all the way to the end. Maybe there was some type of victory, maybe somebody dies, maybe there's something tragic happens, maybe something really good happens. You can tell that. All right. Okay. So let's go and talk a little bit more about the book of Exodus. I want you guys to make sure that you download these PowerPoints so that they can help you. I'm going to come back to that screen. You may also want to download them, save them to your computer. Okay. All right, so it should be up now. Okay, everybody, so let's talk a little bit more about the second book of the Bible. This is Exodus. And if you have your Bible with you, you can kind of take a look at it and kind of thumb through as we're talking. I have mine with me. And so remember, in the first book that we talked about the book of Genesis. Now in the book of Exodus, this particular group that we keep following is the group of Israelites. These are the Israelites. They're Hebrew people. They follow the Jewish tradition. So remember, in the Old Testament, we're not yet into this thing that we know now as Christianity. It hasn't really started yet, but this is the basis of it, okay? And these Israelite people have wandered and found themselves in Egypt, but things are not real cool in Egypt because they're different from those people there, and they find themselves put in slavery from under an individual called Pharaoh. And so Pharaoh's like the leader there, right? And they were treated really horribly. And if you've ever seen the Hollywood rendition of this, the Ten Commandments, Ten Commandments basically pulls out the book of Exodus, you know, and kind of, and you know, you see Charleston Heston and they're and you know they're wow, that's the book of Exodus. Book of the Bible, the book of Exodus is a really comforting book to African Americans. And it was a very comforting book to slaves because they took a lot of the scriptures and it gave them some type of comfort to know that if these people from way back when were in slavery, and if they could make it out, and if God brought them out and watched over them, then God would bring the slaves out as well, you know, the slaves in the Americas. Many times, let me just say this as well, many times also, if you listen to a lot of Negro spirituals, they have a lot of, not examples, but a lot of wording that relates back to Pharaoh, a lot of wording that relates back to the struggle of the slaves in the book of Exodus. So it's really cool how history kind of encourages itself. All right, now what does the word Exodus mean? Exodus. So if you ever go somewhere and you see a door and above it, it says exit, right? We know that we can get out of the building by going through that exit door. So Exodus means to departure or to go out. And so we ask ourselves in the book of Exodus, well, who's departing? Who's going out? The Israelites are departing Egypt. Okay, so just remember that. The Israelites are departing or leaving from Egypt. And so this particular book has a lot of history in it. This book has a lot of history for people who follow the Jewish culture because it helps them to look back and see from where they came from. When we talk about authorship and who wrote the book, now in my Bible, it gives a little, you know, caption up at the top about who wrote it, and it says author Moses according to tradition. And you might see some things like that in your Bible, or if you're looking at it online, because we don't really know for sure. It is so about Moses. The book is so about him, of course. So he could have written a lot of it. He could have dictated some of the information. But there are some parts that theologians say it doesn't sound like Moses, and it may have been somebody else. Now, some of the key things are really kind of interesting that say it could have been somebody else, but in the beginning of the book where you talk about the Israelites in Egypt in chapter 1 and the story of the birth of Moses. Now, many of us, I couldn't tell you, you know, all of the information regarding where I was born. I know the hospital where I was born, but I don't know what happened that day, and I don't, know how people were feeling. I don't know what time of day it was and all that stuff. A lot of people just don't know all of that regarding their birth story. You got to ask your mom or your dad or your grandma or whoever. And so it would be really interesting for Moses to have written that, especially chapter 2. Kind of think about things. Now, maybe that information was passed down to him. That would be really cool. But there are some things even in here in the book of Exodus that we're just not quite sure that he wrote all of, but I definitely can say that Moses really had his hand in this book because he's just all in it, okay? And so if you get a chance to read through, there's some passages that say sound like Moses. There's some passages that don't. Exodus chapter 16, a lot of theologians say 31 through 36 was probably not him. And so you'll see different things like that throughout the writing. All right, let's talk a little bit about the background of Exodus, the book of Exodus. We just said who wrote it, but I want you to also take some time and I want you to Google, what does Moses' name mean? What does the name Moses, what does it mean? And why do you think they named him this? Okay, so I want you to go Google, what does the name Moses mean? And why do you think they named him this? All right, so hopefully you found the answer. And Moses means deliverer or to deliver. And it's really interesting that as Moses grows up and he sees that his people are being mistreated by Pharaoh, he becomes their leader to help them obtain some type of freedom. And so every book of the Bible has a purpose. So you say to yourself, why was this book written? Why was that book written? The book of Exodus to show you who Moses is, to show you that he's a leader and he was called to be a leader to the Israelites. A lot of people could just jump up and say to their leader, but you really see that God had a plan for him and a plan to help these people called the Israelites. The purpose of Exodus is also to show that God shows protection and favor to this group of people called the Israelites. It also shows you that God judges people or other people who harm his people. So you'll see in the story or in the narrative of Exodus that, remember, this group of people, they're having a tough time with slavery under this person named Pharaoh, right? But then God says, look, okay, Pharaoh, you're working my nerves, you're treating my people wrong, and then there are going to be some plagues, 10 plagues that come to harm the Egyptian people. All right, and so I want you to see right here. Here is on the right or in the center of the screen. Here is an image, and this is how Yahweh is written in Hebrew, and this is what the Jewish people write in Hebrew. And Jewish people revered, or they loved God so much, or they honored God so much that they did not even want to write out God's full name. The Jewish people felt that it was disrespectful to write out God's full name. And so they only write, even till this day, they only write YHWH instead of Yahweh, YAHWEH. Okay, and so Yahweh is simply just another name for God. And the name Yahweh means protector, deliverer. So it's really interesting. Remember that Moses's name means deliverer. And in the book of Exodus, we see God acting as a deliverer of the Israelite people. Because remember, they were in this messed up situation and God's got to help them get out. Okay, so later on, if you have your textbook, I want you to go to page 114 and 115. And you could take a look a little bit later at these plagues. And I also want you to take a look at the video that I sent you. Now, there are 10 plagues that will go out to the people of Egypt. And you may be saying, why? Why is God sending all these plagues? Because God keeps telling Pharaoh, you got to let these people go. They should leave them alone. And Pharaoh doesn't respect. Pharaoh's heart's hardened. He's just like a really mean, nasty person. And so God sends these plagues to disturb Pharaoh, to disrupt his power. And they worship these gods that, of course, were not the supreme God, as God is mentioned here, but they worship different gods. And so it is said that each plague that was sent represented the gods, the Egyptian gods that the Egyptians worshipped. Okay. So we see the big conflict here. Let me go back. We see the big conflict here. If we have any type of conflict, the big conflict is between the Israelite people and Pharaoh and God. Okay, let's come back. All right. What is the Passover? So in I believe it's the last plague that we have, one of the plagues that you will see is that God tells them to do some real strange stuff. It might be kind of strange to us, right? And one of the plagues, one of the remedies here is that God says, look, I want you, let's see if I can find it here. I want you, this is in chapter 11, Exodus 11 and 12. And so God says, I'm going to strike Pharaoh down and the land of Egypt with one more blow. So remember, they had all these plagues. The Israelites to get a lamb and to sacrifice this lamb and to sprinkle blood around the doorpost. And that sounds real strange to us. But this symbolizes the first Passover. So in this story, you see that the Israelites, they do what God says because they're tired of being in bondage. And in New Testament, the lamb represents Jesus, and the shedding of blood represents salvation. And the Israelite people follow what God says. They sprinkle this blood on their doorposts. And what happens is the angel of death passes over them, doesn't bother them, but affects the bad people in Egypt. And they're spared or they're saved. And so just imagine, Pharaoh wakes up the next day and sees all these dead people that made him open his eyes. Okay, and so Passover is still celebrated today. It was celebrated kind of like around Easter time, said 2020. Okay, but if you read the book of Exodus chapter 12, you will see more information about the Passover. And the Passover is represented very highly in the Jewish community because they look back. Jewish people take the time and they look back at their history. They see where they came from. Okay, we got to do the same thing too. All right, now in the book of Exodus is one of the really cool things that I think a lot of people may be familiar with is the 10 Commandments. And you'll see in Exodus chapter 20, you could take a look at that later, are the 10 Commandments. So something interesting happens. Their leader Moses is communicating with God and trying to help these Israelite people out. And God says, look, I'm going to help you out, but y'all got to get it right. I have some commandments for you. You got to get it right. And Moses goes up on this mountain, Mount Sinai. You may have heard of that before. And Moses goes up and gets these directions from God. It's called the 10 Commandments. He comes back with these tablets. And isn't it awesome that God wrote this on these tablets, and it presented a sense of order and direction for them because they were just acting up. So they needed some rules. Here's another thing as a food for thought. You guys can take a look at this video a little bit later, but the 10 Commandments are a staple for Christianity as well as Judaism. They aren't the only commandments in the Bible. There are other things that God tells people to do. But if you get a chance, I want you to watch this video up here, and it's called the 42 Principles of Ma'at, okay? Right here. And these African principles started in Egypt. They are very similar. They have a lot of similarities to the 10 Commandments. And I want you to just take a look at that. It's interesting to see what you might think about that and see if the 10 Commandments sound similar to those 42 principles of Ma'at. And it's thought that these African principles started in Egypt, even kind of around that time frame when these things were occurring. Isn't that interesting? Oops. Right. So remember today we went over, this was just a quick run through of the book of Exodus. And I want you to just kind of thumb through yourself. I want you to take a look. I got my Bible here. Take a look at those 10 plagues. These are stories, and you have plots, right? You have characters. You have Moses, you have his brother Aaron, you have a lot of things going on, and it can get confusing. But don't forget to check out those 2 little short videos that I have for you that will give you a lot of explanation onto why these things are occurring in this second book of the Bible. Okay, everybody, I hope that you had a great day. And remember to keep reading. Make sure you get your assignments in by Sunday night. Bye-bye.